Cunliffe.
To the Minister of Economic Development, does he agree with the Prime Minister's statement, and I quote, "If you were really going to go out and buy a country, why wouldn't you want to buy New Zealand? And if so, why?"
The Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr. Speaker, yes. I think the member might find that is what is known as a metaphor, which I would have thought somebody who wrote poetry at Harvard might actually recognise. Even my humble zoology degree, I can recognise a metaphor. The Prime Minister went on to explain that New Zealand is an amazing country. On any relative measure across the world, it's a great country. And I think the point is that compared to many other countries in the world, New Zealand is doing very well. For example, we've grown in 9 of the last 10 quarters. We're investing a huge amount in infrastructure at the same time. We're balancing our books. We're putting a lot of effort into boosting trade, investing billions into higher education, increasing science and innovation funding, and doing the government's bit to help keep interest rates low.
The Honourable David Cunliffe.
Mr. Speaker, to the Minister, what does he think of the optics of trying to sell a country that has just seen an horrific 17% collapse in the value of goods exported, and where the main growth in exports is the 1,000 New Zealanders a week we're exporting to Australia?
The Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr. Speaker, I think the member is confusing the amount of goods with value. The reality is, Mr. Speaker, in the calendar year 2011, New Zealand had very large growth in exports, both in value and volume terms. That has come back a bit as commodity prices has come off this year, but it is still a very positive overall export scene, and the government is working very, very hard to encourage businesses to become more competitive in the world, to provide businesses with opportunities to get ahead, and will continue to do so.
The Honourable David Cunliffe.
Mr. Speaker, does the horrific 17% drop in the value of goods exported mean that the government was wrong to cut export promotion funding to China, India and the rest of Asia as part of the $131 million it has just slashed per annum from Vote Economic Development?
The Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr. Speaker, the member's an emotive actor, but the reality is the government did not cut the sort of sums of money he's talking about at all. He needs to understand that some appropriations finish when events finish that the economic development appropriation is involved with. For example, the member may have spotted, and in fact I think he did, the Rugby World Cup, which occurred last year, and at the end of that period the appropriations for the Rugby World Cup are no longer needed, Mr. Cunliffe, and therefore we didn't continue them. And I know the member just wants to fire hose money in all directions, but actually the government, when appropriations are finished, stops them.
The Honourable David Cunliffe.
To the Minister for Rugby World Cup tickets, why would he sell New Zealand now?
Order. 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 We don't start questions that way. The Honourable David Cunliffe.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, why would he sell New Zealand now when the New Zealand Institute of Economic Research has just downgraded its growth forecast to a stagnant 1.5%? And is this the same logic as selling highly profitable power companies near the bottom of the economic cycle?
The Honourable Stephen Joyce.
Mr. Speaker, I wondered whether the member would bring up NZIER, because one of the interesting things about their report is that they suggest that economic growth will be slower than some of the other commentators, which they're entitled to believe, primarily because New Zealanders are saving more, and actually that will dampen economic growth in the short term. Now, we don't actually agree necessarily with the quantum, but the point that NZIER made is that New Zealand's household and commercial debt, but particularly household debt, built up hugely to an imbalance while the previous government, funnily enough, was in office, and that is now unwinding. So if there's any concerns about that actually slowing economic growth, they can only be sheeted home to the behaviour and the economy of the previous government.
The Honourable David.
Mr. Speaker.
Point of order, the Honourable David.
Mr. Speaker, I seek leave to table the full New Zealand Institute of Economic Research quarterly predictions report made public today, which lists fiscal headwinds slowing global growth migration drains and businesses treading cautiously as amongst the reason for slashing, again, New Zealand's growth output.
Leave us sort of table that document. Is there any objection? There is objection.
Oh, how interesting. Mr Speaker, point of order.
Point of order, the Honourable David Cunliffe.
I seek leave to table a graph created by the Parliamentary Library which shows the huge growth in exports of New Zealanders to Australia since this national government came to power.
Leave us sought to table that document from the Parliamentary Library. Is there any objection? There is objection.
Can't stand the truth.
Question number 8, Holly Walker.